Welcome to this NORR for 2024. This year, we address the future of architecture and engineering, as you can see with this year's guest speakers. As founder and host 18 years ago of NORR, my objective was to meet three main goals: to teach, to learn, to improve, and to do that continuously. The program relies on the best guest speakers in three series: architecture, engineering, and masters. Each of the NORR virtual sessions since 2020 has been recorded and are available on NORR YouTube for global access. This session is being recorded and will be posted in a few weeks. Our guests are invited at no cost through our 14 global offices, and we are proud to include the 16 schools of architecture in our invited program. Today we have a celebration of Buckminster Fuller. In 1968, at 16 years old, I went to a school trip to Expo 67 in Montreal. Arranged by George Harvey Secondary School, the trip was for our high school architectural drafting class. We arrived and the mini rail transported us to the site towards Buckminster Fuller's 62-meter high geodesic dome designed for the US Pavilion. Having studied Fuller's Manhattan geodesic dome in our architectural drafting and design textbook, we all thought it was so futuristic it would never be realized. As we pierced through the self-supporting tectodrome structure, we became believers. The experience blew our minds. Suspended in the freestanding space, the precision and perfection of the geometry, the purity of the dome, the span and the height of the space. For the first time in my life, I appreciated the power of form and believe it was the origin of my interest to go beyond drafting to become an architect. At that moment, the dome represented a wonder world of the future. Buckminster Fuller, inventor, architect, engineer, and philosopher, was a man of progressive ideas and urbanism, efficiency, and transport, and defined that moment for me. This NORR today celebrates Buckminster Fuller in a special way with 5 people that knew him and will speak about how he has influenced the world, and they include Thomas Zung, Lord Norman Foster, Shirley Sarkey, Alexandra May, Tommy Zung, and I will introduce them individually. I will start with Thomas T.K. Zung. Thomas is best known as a partner of Buckminster Fuller, Sado, and Zung. He was Bucky's second partner. Fuller's first partner was the late Shojo Sado. Zung worked with Temcor's Spruce Goose Dome, a dome company co-founded by Black Mountain College student Don Richer. Epcot, the Fly Eyes Dome and Fuller's last invention. The Hang It All worked on museum edition Fuller Tensegrity geodesic domes with Carol Solway Gallery. Zung, author, Patney, is a distinguished senior fellow at the Stanford University Libraries. Welcome, Thomas Zung.
Thank you very much, Silvio, for that very warm introduction. My talk today is about Call Me Trim Tab, Spaceship Earth with Buckminster Fuller. Bucky used to say that we had this beautiful planet Earth, and it's really a spaceship, but it didn't come up with any introductions. So because it didn't have any introductions, any combat that he could look to, he said, I'm going to do a book, and he called it Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. Bucky was born in 1895 and he died in 1983. The amazing thing about this period of history is that in 1895, mankind had not invented the airplane yet. When Bucky was 9 years old, it was when the airplane was invented. Telegraph was the main communication, no such thing as television. And yet, in 1969, when he was 79 years old, man had gone from cars and horse and buggy to the moon. What an incredible time. And Bucky said, through science and through technology, man can do everything he needs to do. And his entire life was concerned about endangered Earth. How could we take this Earth and sustain it for all the different people in the world and give it to them freely? He said, what can one man do? And he called himself Guinea Pig Big. And he said to me, call me Trim Tabs. Something hit me very hard, thinking about what one little man can do. Think about the Queen Mary. The whole ship goes by and then comes the rudder. And there's this tiny thing at the end of the rudder called a trim tab. It's a miniature rudder. Just moving the little trim tab builds a low pressure that pulls the rudder around. Takes almost no effort at all. And I said the little individual can be a trim tab. Society thinks it's going to right by you. It's left you all together. But if you are doing dynamic things mentally, the fact is you can just put your foot out just like that and the whole ship of state is going to go. So I said, call me Trim Tab, R. Buckminster Fuller. Bucky believed in history, and he said the further one breath into history, the further delves into the future. So we're going into the past, but we're also going into the future. In the future, 500 years ago, Leonardo da Vinci had drawn the winged man. And the winged man was basically a bicycle. And he said to himself, why is that not being able to work? It's because 500 years later, the Gossamer Albatross was able to take flight. The Gossamer Albatross could take flight because Bucky said there was a new invention, and it was called Mylar. It had a PSI of about 500 PSI, while Da Vinci at that time only had 150 PSI. So therefore, a 98-pound man could fly the Indian Channel. Why? Because of technology. Said Bucky about synergy.
Synergy is a companion word to the word energy. Synergy means behavior of whole systems unpredicted by behavior of every part. It's the only word that means it. The fact that humanity is unfamiliar with the word means that humanity does not think that our behaviors of wholes are unpredicted by parts. The very essence of our solar system, our whole scheme of our universe is held together by these synergetic behaviors.
So to be able to do some of the things, he talked about synergy. Bucky was a fifth generation student at Harvard. And because he was the fifth generation, they allowed to go in. But unfortunately, his father had passed away, and Harvard had this insidious club they called eating clubs. And unless you had a lot of money, and you were not able to join these clubs. So these were the club dandies, as he talked about. So he became his own dandy, so to speak. And what he did is he cut up a little bit, and he took out and went to the Will Rogers Follies, and he also went to the, which is equivalent to the Follies of Ziegfeld Follies. And the main character at that particular time was a female by the name of Marilyn Miller, which was a Marilyn Monroe of her day. And so Bucky, being a dandy that he was, he took out the entire chorus line of the George White scandals at Churchill's, and he blew his allowance. So when it came time to pay tuition, of course, he didn't have any. So Harvard said, I'm sorry, you're going to be dismissed. So he was, as he said, fired for the first time. His family was very upset, and they were just shameful. And they said, my goodness, we need to teach him a lesson. So they sent Bucky up to Sherwood, Canada, at a factory. Well, that idea backfired because Bucky loved that factory. He was able to do things with his hand. Bucky always liked to do things with his hand. In fact, he even invented something at Sherwood, and they wanted to keep him. But his mother said, no, he needs to go back. He's a Harvard fifth generation. He needs to graduate. So he went back. As I mentioned, his father passed away, and he said, Mother, I'm really wasting my time here. So I need to quit. And he did. And he used to like to say, I was fired from Harvard twice. And during that period of time, after that, he went to Greenwich Village, and there was a pub. His pub was called Marie Marie. And in that pub, he met people like Bill Barrett, the puppeteer, Alexander Calder, everybody knows who he was. Martha Graham, who came up with a new style of dancing. Isamu Noguchi, who later became his best friend. And that pub closed and they moved it up. And his daughter, Allegra, said yes, and Dad moved up to the 3 Hours of Lunch Bunch, where he met Christopher Morley and Edward Stone. And these people would have a major impact on Bucky because he was so interested not only in architecture and engineering, but art and thinkers. And his best friend became Isamu Noguchi, and here he is in Greenwich Village. The Isamu Noguchi then turned his studio into a museum. It's called the Isamu Noguchi Museum and Gardens, and next year it'll be the 40th anniversary. And we have now somebody that really worked with Isamu Noguchi and Shoji, who later became director of the museum. That's Amy Howe. And Alexandra is going to talk a little bit about that later because she was the associate person in charge of education at the museum. His first foray into housing was in 1927 4D housing. D, incidentally, does not stand for dimension, it stands for dynamic. And so the 4D house was something that Bucky thought about. It was basically a pole hanging a building from a pole, and he called it a pole building. And this building was then redrawn when he was going out with his future father-in-law, and that was James Hewlett. And so this is the drawing of the hexagon. And that this is a model of the Dymaxium house, and it was called a Dymaxium house because he exhibited it at the very famous store in Chicago. And the PR director there said, you know, Bucky, you're a very unusual man. You talk about things in 4 dimensions, in 4 syllables, and we need to invent a word for you. So he sat down with Bucky and he said, you know, I've come up with a word and I hope you'll think about it. And that word was Dymaxium. Di for dynamic, max for maxium, and shin for action. Dymaxium. And this is the word that Bucky liked so much, he used it for the rest of his life on many of his projects, Dymaxium. About this time in about 1930s, he was thinking about transportation. He said, well, transportation is more than just a car. It can also be an airplane and a submarine. So he thought about this as the entire transportation. Then he came down and talked about it more as a practical, and that was as a car. He had his best friend, Isamu Noguchi, do this model. So here you see the model. It looks like a torpedo. And he also enlisted a friend by name of Starling Burgess. And Starling Burgess was a naval architect that could also help him with the Dymaxium car. So here's the Dymaxium car of 1933. The Dymaxium car of 1933 was car number 2. Car number 1 was sent to Chicago. In car number 1, he asked a race car driver, a French race car driver, to drive it from New York to Chicago. And while he was there, because it was such an unusual car, it was rubbernecked. It was rubbernecked to the point that they had an accident. That accident regretfully killed a race car driver and hurt a lot of other people. And the newspapers, of course, had a field day because they blamed Bucky. But the interesting thing about all this is that sensationalism wasn't accurate. Bucky was at the time of the accident in Chicago. He was in New York trying to get people to invest into his car. I wanted to show this picture because in 1933 you saw the Bucky's car, and this is what cars looked like in 1933. And the person that was helped talk about Bucky's car was Amelia Earhart. She and H.G. Wells and Eleanor Roosevelt actually rode in the car. Here's a car with Bucky looking at it, and the engine we wanted to point out was not done by Fuller. It was done by the Ford Motor Company, which he purchased just to get the car into production faster. And here's the car in 1933. Some of you remember Barnum and Bailey had a circus, and they used to have a little car where all the clowns came out. And I used to say to the audience, if you could tell me how many students came out of the car, I'll give you a Dymaxium map. And here's the video of the Dymaxium car, and here you see the 1933 car at about the same time. What a difference. At that time, he wrote a book. It's called Nine Chains to the Moon, and he first met Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright said to Bucky, Bucky, you're an engineer interested in architecture, and I'm an architect interested in engineering. We should get along famously. And they did. They were lifelong friends, and both of them passed away. And this is the book, this is the Nine Chains to the Book story that Mr. Wright wrote for him. And many years later, as a Frank Lloyd Wright awarded to Bucky posthumously the Frank Lloyd Wright Creativity Award, and it was we thought it was only reciprocal that we gave to Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation the Dymaxium Award, and I presented Mrs. Wright with a geodesic dome, and on the right you see Bucky's grandson, Jamie. Bucky's family came from England, from the Island of Wight. The Island of Wight is just south of London. And during World War II, when the Nazis were taking over and taking care of where food and produce was not being given to England, Bucky said, we need to help them. So he took Dymaxium car number 2, and he went out and he campaigned to get food for Britain. So it was all-out aid. It was food for Britain so they wouldn't go hungry. Bucky was a 90-day wonder at the United States Naval Academy, and he was there for several years, and he graduated as a lieutenant. And he was always concerned about what would happen when the militaries came out. In World War II, when the military came out, they didn't have any housing at all. And again, housing was something that he was always concerned about, high-speed, affordable housing. So he came up with this idea, which was with the Butler Grain Bin. And he called it the DDU unit, which is Dymaxium Dwelling Unit. This was his soldiers. And he had his students and people living in it to see how it was used. And this person here is Wally Saunders, who later was going to become the head of the School of Architecture at the University of Michigan, where I attended school. And during this period of time, at the end of World War II, he produced the Dymaxium car and Dymaxium dwelling unit, and it was done at Wichita, Kansas, and so he called it the Wichita House. The Wichita House was then restored, and it was put at the Henry Ford Museum, and the Henry Ford Museum said this is the most interested and the most attended exhibit that they have. This is by Clara Deck and Mark Gunther, who's the vice president of Henry Ford Museum. Bucky also said that because we had the advent of the automobile, it was no longer an east-west world, sailing ships. It was really a north-south world. So he needed to have a new map to consider that, because the Mercator back no longer made any sense anymore. So you can see his first foray, which I'm showing you, was a square with triangles put on. And this was done in the early 40s. And later on, he said he required his first partner, Shoji Sadawa. Shoji had for 4 years been enlisted in the army, and he had been a cartographer. So being a cartographer, he really understood the notions of how maps were put together, and he was able to help with Bucky on this Dymaxium map, which is an icosahedron. So they're all triangles and not squares and triangles. And so this was a Dymaxium map that he produced that with Bucky and Shoji Sadawa, and it's been used all the time. The icosahedron is folded together and you get a 6-inch globe. In 1948 and 1949, Bucky went to Black Mountain College. And he went there, and the faculty were people like Joseph Albers, John Cage, and Merce Cunningham, who became his best friends, William and Elaine de Kooning, Walter Gropius, Richard Rithold, and interesting, his students were Musa Posawa and Albert Lanier. Arthur Penn, who later became a great director of movies, Ken Snelson, Robert Rauschenberg, and Don Richter, who we mentioned was going to be into TempCore and would produce a lot of the domes for Bucky Fuller. It was here that the idea of the dome really germinated. So at Black Mountain College, Bucky said, we're going to have the students study this dome and we're going to put one up. And so they worked all summer and they put up the geodesic dome. At the same time, at the same, students were working, Bucky got friendly with Merce Cunningham and Alun de Kooning because he was so interested in the arts, because he felt that art and architecture was a synthesis of synergy. And here the students put up the Supine Dome. It was called the Supine Dome by Elaine de Kooning. Why? Because they had worked all summer, and this was, as Albert Lanier would say, the second coming of Moses. He says, but what happened is after we had done all this work, punched all the Venetian blinds, put it up, he said, all the students came out for this rising of the dome, and nothing happened. So it just laid there, and Elaine de Kooning called it the Supine Dome. They were so silent, and everybody was disappointed. Everybody but Bucky. And Bucky said, no, 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 no. Success, success. He said, what do you mean? Out of failure comes success. And this is something that's very important in Bucky's life. He said, out of failure comes success. And he has many failures, but many more successes. So the patent was finally done in 1954. And as we know, a year after the Supine Dome, the dome became successful. And here he got it patented. We showed in our office this geodesic dome to show that Bucky was more than just the geodesic dome. He was more than just a patent number 268. He was, in fact, a thinker and somebody who was going to concern about what's going to happen with spaceship Earth. Here is Buckminster Cathedral, the actual piece in 1967. It shows the early U.S. satellite. Some of you remember the first satellite was Sputnik by Russia, and this was done by the U.S. and shown in the pavilion that Bucky had done. The interiors, by the way, was done by Cambridge 7 and not by Bucky. And here's a clip of the actual Buckminster Cathedral, with the monorail going through a building for the first time. We should note that most pavilions and expositions are only good for 6 months. So this is a question of doing something, if what Bucky would always say, ephemeralization, doing more with less, doing it in the quickest time possible, in the most inexpensive way, and the least amount of harm to the environment. Right after Expo 67 came the elongated geodesic dome. This is a college in Cleveland State University. They had a college called Fenn College, which was a night school, and they turned it into Cleveland State University. This is about 1968. And they said that we wanted to have a gymnasium, but we don't want a geodesic dome because it's too large. We just want a small one so they could play basketball and also for volleyball. So this is our idea for the elongated geodesic dome, and it was called CSU Intramural Sports Center. It was only supposed to be up for about 4 or 5 years at the most. 3 was what we projected it. But the students liked it so much, it was up for 30 years. And we painted the inside of it, and we painted the exterior red, because we knew that someday in the future, there would be a gymnasium, and you see the gymnasium there. And this is a close-up of the dome, which Bucky called the Caterpillar Dome. And that's Tommy when he was about, my son, when he was about 5.5 years old. Cleveland is also the home of the American Society of Metals. This is something that Bucky was very proud of because he was the inspiration. The American Society of Metals is an organization that is now international. They study all the metals in the world, and the symbol underneath the dome was all the rare metals, all the rare metals that on Earth. And so this particular dome was something that was a exploration of mankind's innovation, and the actual structure was done by Synergetics, a company he had founded and turned over to others. About that time, there was an energy crisis. Energy crisis, some of you remember, all the lights went out in New York City and other major cities. This is about the mid-70s. And Bucky said, it wasn't a crisis of energy, it's a crisis of ignorance and selfishness. So he put this dome up, and he had showed you doing, and it goes from the Hudson River to the East River, from the tip of Central Park down to about 14th Street. He said, if you could contain that energy, if you contain the energy that goes with it, he said, you could do an awful lot. And so this is to tell people how that there are solutions to the energy prices. During this particular same time where he did this Triton Floating City, Japan had a sponsor that said, we would like to do something that is going to have housing for the masses, which again, really interested Bucky and Shoji. And the reason being is that Tokyo had no more room for housing. So this was to be floated in Tokyo Bay. The sponsor unfortunately passed away. And so the project stayed for a while until it was picked up by President Lyndon Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson says, hey, we should do this for HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So he took on this project for HUD, and it was really going quite speedily and was going to really be done. But unfortunately, as we know, Lyndon Johnson did not make the second term of office because of the Vietnam War. And so this project has been abandoned only because there was no President Johnson for the second term. But President Johnson liked it so much that he kept it, and he has it now displayed prominently in the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Texas. Bucky also said to our office, he said, you know, Tommy, he says, we should do something for the urban environment, something that's very compact. So this is the 1,000-foot geodesic dome. This as the be able to save energy and also to make it very safe for the families. These 12 towers is the apartment houses, and the apartment houses would then save energy and be ephemeralization, doing more with less. This was done in our office and was abandoned because Bucky had passed away. At that particular time, also in the 70s, was when he first met Norman Foster. And when he met Norman Foster, it was about a competition that Norman's going to be talking about later. And it was very famously because at the end of the session with Norman Foster, famously, Bucky said, how much does your building weigh, Mr. Foster? And Norman will be talking about it in his talk. After Bucky passed away, we had his vast archives, which he called the Corner File. The Corner File was every piece of paper that Bucky ever had, everything from laundry tickets to tickets for parking to grocery bills. And this was picked up by Stanford universities. Other universities wanted it. Harvard wanted it. Princeton wanted it. NYU, just a lot of schools. But it was picked up by Stanford University, and it was really done very well. And it's been digitized, and it's digitized and is open to a lot of other people. So it was done by Michael Keller, Lady Foster, and the person in the sweater is Roberto Trujillo, who's head of special collections, Norman Foster, and myself. So Norman visited the library for one specific person. We need to rediscover Buckminster Fuller. And in order to be able to rediscover Bucky, he said we should have a museum show. So the museum show, the heart of the museum show would be the Dymaxion car. And it would be called the Dymaxion World of Buckminster Fuller. And Norman was going to curate it, and here is the car being taken apart. The car belonged to Horror's Museum. This car number 2, and the quid pro quo is that Foster was going to borrow it with the idea that the interiors was going to be redone. The interiors had been trashed, and so this was a wonderful way for Horror's Museum in Reno, Nevada, to get car number 2 restored. And it was restored originally the same way as Bucky did it, which ash wood, and here it is. And here's car number 4, done by Norman Foster. The interesting thing is Bucky said that there was a car, it was also an airplane, it was also an automobile. So if you have an automobile and if you have a submarine, you're not going to have side mirrors. So what was going to be done was that you need to be able to turn left and right. So they used periscopes. So here's a periscope on the left and a periscope on the right. And here's car number 4. It just looks like it's leaping into the another century. Here's Norman Foster taking it for the ride. And it's going down the highway, as Bucky would say, is a Zoom mobile. When you have this picture, it's interesting because here you have this 1933 Dymaxion car, and you also have a 747, and one asks himself, which was designed first? Here is the car number 4 in front of Norman Foster's Swiss Re building in London. The Swiss Re building is very interesting because it's Bucky's notion of ephemeralization, doing more with less. Flat buildings absorb energy because sun just bounces into and they get very hot. But when you have a round building, which is this, which he called it a gherkin, it bounces off, the sunlight bounces off so it doesn't get hot. Also, the shape of the building, what he called a gherkin, would have the winds going around it, and so all the heat would go away from the building, and so it would be a much cooler building. Again, ephemeralization, doing more with less. Here is the exhibition that Norman Foster curated at Lady Foster's Ivory Press in Madrid. On the right, you see the iconic photograph of Bucky by Yusuf Karsh, and the bust of Bucky by his friend Isamu Noguchi. And of course, you see the Dymaxion house, you see Expo 67, you see the various tensegrities that we did for Bucky. We did about 12 tensegrities of Bucky, which shows his ideas and his integrity of how nature takes geometry and makes it work. And so these were done with the Carl Solway galleries, and there were about 12 of them, and they're at various museums around the world. The interesting about this slide is car number 1 and car number 4. In the foreground, you see the white model, and that's car number 1, and you see the green, British green color, and that's car number 4. And I think this is the most interesting photograph. You see a young person staring at a car a century older than herself. Bucky Fuller. So advanced, so innovative, so inventive. We wanted to thank Lady Foster for hosting the wonderful show, and we gave her a signed autograph, Geodesic Dome by Bucky, and she has that holding in the middle. And this is the photograph of Bucky Fuller's staff, Shirley Chartier in the right, who started with Bucky as a student and stayed with the office until 6 months after he died. The next one is Tommy Zung, and the one's myself, and Michael Keller, head of Stanford University, and the Hereford Museum director, which we're the museum going to next, and George Burke Jones from our office. We were so pleased of this exhibit for Bucky that we were able to find a last autograph book on Bucky by his son-in-law, Bob Snyder. Bob Snyder, incidentally, was a filmmaker, and he won the Academy Award for doing The Titan, which is a story of Michelangelo at the Sistine Chapel. So we were just so thrilled that we were able to find a book and give it to Norman. Nobody deserved it better. Ephemeralization, doing more with less. Here's an example of one of Bucky's, one of Gordon Foreman's most famous works, and this is the Apple headquarters, and this is David Nelson showing me staying, and I'm sure Norman's going to be talking about more of this later. 50 years of design science. 1933, Dymaxion car. 1983, Lysidome. This was shown at John Denver at Aspen, and John Denver had just written a song, What One Man Can Do.
There once was a square with a romantic flair, pure balsamic him mead and white. In the mood that ensued, he went factory nude, Miss Gropius, Corbu, and Wright. From home to a dome, where Georgian and Gothic once stood, now chemical bonds alone got our blonde, and even the plumbing looks good. Let architects sing of aesthetics that bring rich clients and poets to their knees. Just give me a home in a great circle dome where the stresses and strains are at ease. From home to a dome on the crest of the neighboring hill,
where the chores are all done before they're begun, and eclectic nonsense is nil. Let modern folks dream of glass boxes with steam out along suburbia way. Spit level, spit loan, spit breadwinner homes, no down money, lifetime to pay. Roam home to a dome. No banker went back with a dime. No mortgage to show, no payments to go, where your dream dwell and spend your own time.
Wasn't that fun? Here's the Flyside Dome, and the Flyside Dome is now at the Crystal Bridges Museum. The Crystal Bridges Museum is exhibiting it with Alice Wharton at the and we really appreciate that, because here she is, Alice Wharton, who's the daughter of Walmart, and her architect, Moshe Safdie. And the reason is because she has thousands and thousands of people going through contemporary. It's happening right now. We were just there in the May of this year. And all these people can be exhibiting and taking a look at Bucky's dome, and they can be saying, oh, who is this person? And how they're going to discover Bucky Fuller, his ideas in a new, innovative way. So this is something that's very contemporary, and we're very pleased, and I think Bucky would love it. And this is his friend, Moshe Safdie, and this is the actual museum at Crystal Bridges. The museum is important because, again, we're saying that these people will be going through free to see Bucky Fuller. Moshe Safdie is somebody Bucky knew from Expo 67. Bucky always interested in housing. And Moshe Safdie at that time, in 1967, had done Habitat, and the Habitat was a housing project, and this is something that they had in common. Here's the Flyside Dome, the last one we worked on with Bucky, with his daughter Allegra. This is the 26-footer. The 26-footer is now housed in Florida. They call it the Florida Art Basel, and as I think in a 50-footer is in Crystal Bridges. Bucky was one of the first people to come to China after it was open to allow foreigners to come in. And they wanted to know more about the geodesic dome and about his ideas. So this is the model that we made. It shows the 450-foot dome. It shows a hotel and a thing. And it was done by the foreign minister, Zhang Wenjing. People don't know, but foreign minister Zhang Wenjing and Henry Kissinger faked being sick, and they went to Pakistan. And they went there for one reason only, to do the Shanghai Accord. The Shanghai Accord was the accord that allowed Nixon to go to China and open up the U.S. to China-Sino relationship. So it's a very important historical thing. At the same time, he became the first ambassador to the U.S., and Zhang Wenjing wanted to have Bucky show his ideas in China. So we were invited, and here he's showing it about. And we opened the model in Beijing, along with Ohio Governor Richard Celeste, who later was going to be a Chinese ambassador to a U.S. ambassador to India. And of course, unfortunately, the project didn't go ahead. It was abandoned because of the Tiananmen incident. They don't like to say Max was the incident. I show this slide because it's very interesting about how Bucky has an impact long after he's gone. Remember, Bucky died in 1983, and the Nobel Prize was in 1996. How did that happen? Because Harry Kroto and his wife Margaret had gone to Expo 67 after it was closed, and they looked at the geometry, and it intrigued them. They looked at the geometry, they said, you know, there's something here. The geometry is very similar to the C60 molecule that we're working on. So Harry Kroto called his friends, Bob Curl and Rick Smalley, and said, we need to study Bucky more and the geometry to see how this has an impact on our C60. And in 1996, lo and behold, to their credit, the geodesic dome had an entrance because it was called the Buckminster Fullerene, the Bucky Ball. It was all done by Harry Kroto and Robert Curl. Bob Curl helped us a great deal, as well as Harry, with many post-Bucky projects. And here you see the Nobel Prize. The post-Bucky projects was a dome that was containing oil as it leaked in there, and also some other projects that we worked on. Sadly, Harry Croder died of ALS, and Bob Curl passed away just last year. Several people came to me and they said, you know, we need to put Bucky in today's history, and a lot of people just don't know him. So I said the best way is to talk about Bucky in his own words. So we did an anthology, because Bucky used to get irate. He said he didn't mind if people didn't understand him, but he used to get awfully irate if people misunderstood him. So we didn't want anybody to misunderstood Bucky. So we put this anthology together with 20 different people to do an introduction. And then later on, the anthology became so popular, they asked me to do the second one, which has pictures, and it's produced by Southern Illinois University. This is Bucky explaining to me Trip Tab, not recognizing that 20 years later, I would have to be thinking about Trim Tab and putting it into a book. This is my latest book on Call Me Trim Tab, Navigating Spaceship Earth with Bucky. It's put out now, as Time Magazine would say, his messiah of ideas condensed into one book. This book I consider to be a very short book. You might call it a book that is for very busy people, because their time span is so dimensionally important. It is what you might call a book for very busy people. And people have also wanted to see how Bucky lived in his own house for 12 years at Carbondale, Illinois. And this was his house that was being restored by one of his professors, Bill Perk, and the restoration was done by Blair Wolfram. And during that period of time also, we had started thinking about a Buckminster Fuller Institute. His daughter and Jamie reinstituted the Buckminster Fuller Institute where it stands today. And we also wanted to have Bucky was hands-on, and so we did workshops. The workshops were done with Isamu Noguchi's shojis at Isamu Noguchi Museum. We've also had workshops at Henry Ford Museum, at other areas. And so we said we need to have a home for it. So later we landed in Rhode Island School of Design. And so we had about 4 or 5 symposiums there. During this time also, Shoji Sadao said, you know, Bucky's best friend was Isamu Noguchi. We need to have a show showing Best of Friends. So he curated a show, Best of Friends. And you see here in the photograph, the bust of Bucky that Isamu Noguchi did in 1929. And so that show went on to other areas. During that period of time, Bucky would say that when I do an invention, when it's finished and I look at it, if it isn't beautiful, it isn't successful. It's a failure. So he really considered art and his inventions to be one and the same. So he would take the acronym right now of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, without the A, and he'd take an issue with that. So we went back to Yusuf Karsh, friends, and particularly Jerry Fielder and Estrelita Karsh. We said, we need to do something about going from STEM to STEAM. She said, well, let's make a proclamation. So she made a proclamation of STEM to STEAM through synergy. And she did it through Rhode Island School of Design. And to codify that, she gave an entire portfolio series of artists from Yusuf Karsh to the university, from STEM to STEAM. Bucky would smile on that one. Because otherwise, where would you put people like Pablo Casals, Georgia O'Keeffe, Yo-Yo Ma? Music, and if I might add, music, such an integral part of Bucky. Music, they used to say, was the architecture of. We had many museum shows, and here it is in the Whitten Museum. It's also had another museum, Henry Ford Museum, and others. And we wanted to show Bucky, to explore him to a new audience. He also had a friend, Doug Jacobs, who did a play, The History and Mystery of the Universe, and some of you may have seen it. We wanted to kind of, the United States Post Office always had commemorative stamps for important people, and so we wanted to have one for Bucky. 50 years of the geodesic dome. people don't know this, but the family cannot do this. We had to enlist the aid of others. So the enlistment was myself, Shirley Sharkey, and Tony Houston. Tony Houston, a screenwriter, and it just so happens his father was the famous John Houston of African Queen and Maltese Falcon. And it was unveiled at Stanford University. We were successful, and the museum and the dome stamp was unveiled with his friend Buzz Aldrin and Allegra Fuller. It was unknowns to us at the same time. The U.S. postage stamp was also done for his best friend, Shoji Sadao. And as one of my friends used to say, there's no such thing as a coincidence. These are one of the last things that we were able to record with Bucky before he passed away.
What is now as clear as the speed of light itself is our realization that we've come to enough knowledge about how to do so much with so little, understand enough about our great universe and man in the universe to realize his function is that of the mind, ability to bring great order. And we have the beautiful realization that Einstein's great conceptioning can go from weaponry to livingry, and it is now practical. Metaphysical really master the physical. This is what man tends to call utopia. It's a fairly small word, but inadequate to describe the extraordinary new freedom of man in a new relationship to the universe, the alternative which is oblivion.
This is one of the last things he wrote to our office. And he said in this particular memo, human integrity is uncompromising commerce to self-determining whether or not to take initiatives and support or cooperate with others in accord with the truth, all the truth and nothing but the truth. Depends entirely on the integrity of the human individual and not on the political and economic systems. The cosmic question has been asked, are humans a worthwhile to universe invention? Buckminster Fuller, February 14th, 1983, St. Valentine's Day and Chinese New Year's. Very simply, Bucky and Ann's headstone at Mount Auburn. Call me Trim Tab. Spaceship Earth. Said Wally Schirra, I left Earth 3 times. I look back and see this beautiful blue planet. It's the only home I know. As Bucky Fuller would say, please take care of it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thomas Zung, thank you very much for that incredible history of Bucky, and for those that are on this Zoom virtual series, hopefully you've opened their minds. I think it's, Buckminster Fuller is somebody that I think most people either did not know about, or if they did know about, have forgotten about. And hopefully you've reminded them who he was, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I'd like to introduce Lord Norman Foster, Honorary FAIA, Fosters and Partners. He is the recipient of the Pritzker Prize and the Japan Premium Imperial Award. He was a close colleague of Fuller, worked on notable Fuller ideas. His work include Masdar's City Master Plan in Abu Dhabi, a city with 0 carbon emissions, Apple Park, California, powered 100% by renewable energy, and 30 St. Mary Acts, the Gherkin in London. And I want to thank and introduce Lord Norman Foster to the audience. Lord Foster, if you can please join us.
Sure, I'm with you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. And I think that Thomas would like to have a conversation with you about Bucky.
Yes, Norman, I think the first question I'd like to ask you is, what brought you and Buckminster Fuller together?
Well, it was 1971, and I was approached through a mutual friend who said Bucky's got his first project in the United Kingdom, and he's interviewing possible collaborators. So a lunch was arranged with Bucky. And of course, Bucky was at that time just the most incredible hero. And I guess that really what comes before I talk about the meeting Buckminster Fuller, who became Bucky as we worked together, collaborated, and became good friends, is that the message or the messages that Bucky brought to generations of young architects like myself, students, was this awareness of the fragility of the planet. And his messages and his writings and his philosophy, I think, is even more relevant now than it was back half a century ago. So just returning, so a lunch was set up in the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London. And although I only realized it afterwards, it was really an interview. And so Bucky encouraged me to talk about the kind of projects that I was working on and the whole environmental theme in the very early 70s. This is 1971. And Bucky, very much an influence behind that. And so it became apparent that really in many ways I was seeking to practice what Bucky had been preaching, converting it into architecture. So his first project, by the way, at the end of the lunch, I turned to Bucky and said something like, well, I know that you're interviewing architects, and I've organized the studio to receive you and to show you the kind of things that we're doing in the hope that you might select me. No, he said, it's all decided. I'm going to work with you, and you're the architect. And so that was the beginning, as it were, the end of the lunch and the beginning of a 12-year collaboration. So just going through one or two images of that project, it's St. Peter's College, Oxford, and it was going to be the Samuel Beckett Theatre, and there were an extraordinary list of the great and famous in the world of theatre. And because there was no available site, it was going to be below the ground, underneath that quadrangle. And the next one, the next image, you've already seen this. This is Bucky and working with an engineer that I brought in, a cost economist. So it was very much a team effort. The next image shows the cross-section underneath that quadrangle. And then the next image is a three-dimensional rendering of that. And then in our foundation, in the archive, there's a model constructed to show the next image, how that submarine-like structure would be connected to the quadrangle above. And Bucky impressed us by his practicality, which was not very, can I say, the image of Bucky at that time, which was very much a theorist. And so when the team bombarded him with questions about how you'd waterproof it, and he said, no, it'd be just like a submarine. I mean, you'd let the water come in and you'd pump it out. You wouldn't try and resist the forces of nature. And then he did a sketch, which is the next image, showing how that submarine-like shape. And at one point in this conversation, he leapt out of the room and returned from the bathroom with a bar of soap. And the next image shows that bar of soap, which he used to convey the shape of this submarine-like theatre, and Julie inscribed it, the Oxford Beckett Theatre, and signed it Buckminster Fuller. That, I think, is...
At the end of that meeting, you were talking about some other projects that you were going to do with Bucky. And so this is where he famously said to you at the end of the meeting, as I recall, "Tell us, Bucky, how much does your building weigh, Mr. Foster?"
Well, if you come to the next image, it's Bucky and myself in a building that at that time, this must have been 1978, and I flew Bucky in the helicopter to the museum, and he was, again, just an insight into how observant he was. We started at one end of the building. We walked through the building, walked through the restaurant, then came back, and along the way, he was fascinated by some of the Eskimo figures in the vitrine and talked about scale, the scale of a small sculpture in a large space. And then when we returned to the restaurant, he noticed that the sun had moved. He talked about the ambient temperature, the relationship. So an extraordinary observant individual. And when we sat down around in the main gallery here, he said something along the lines of, "Well, how much does it weigh, Norman?" And of course, I had no idea, but I did later bounce back, and it's the next image. I did bounce back with an inventory of the various elements, and then he returned that correspondence with, and he likens the building and its 5,000 tons to an ocean freighter. And I realized afterwards and did some calculations, and of course it confirmed everything about Bucky's philosophy. A tiny amount of the weight of that building was the main gallery spaces, which you saw Bucky and I talking in. That great kind of volume was a fraction of the total tonnage, and the basement below, that was a service spine, was most of the weight. So it echoed this theme of Bucky, who I remember at one point was kind of telling everybody that buildings should be accompanied by their weight as a measure of their performance. This mantra of doing more with less, of conserving energy, of conserving the precious resources of the planet.
Next question, Norman, is do you have any unbuilt Fuller-related projects?
I think all the projects that Bucky and I worked on were never realized. But of course, as you point out, with the images of the so-called gherkin, or if we were to look at the Reichstag dome, in Berlin of the new parliament. But here, if we is one unbuilt project, which is the autonomous house, and this was going to be a dwelling which would be, as the name implies, autonomous. It would have shades which move around it, and the idea was that as a family we would have a version in the countryside, and Bucky and his family would have one in Los Angeles. There are sequence now. If you just move through the slides, you'll see Bucky and the team as we explore. This was cut in America, shipped over, and we assembled it. And here you can see it against night sky. Very beautiful, ephemeral spheres, an outer sphere of the proposed, just giving a glimpse, incomplete, of the shading sphere. So unrealized, but we are hopefully in the longer term looking to realize an updated version of that for a kind of exhibition estate of works of art and architecture in Provence. And so this is an updated version of the autonomous house. So
Norman, I wanted to chime in that Bucky was very excited about this because, as you know, he lived in a dome home for 12 years in Carbondale, and he had mentioned this to Lady, we called her Lady Ann. She was such a lady. And so Ann was very excited about moving into a new dome. She was looking forward to it. And we should tell the audience that regretfully this didn't happen because both of them, both Ann and Bucky, passed away before this could happen. But it was something that it was very close to his heart. He really appreciated your working on it. So the next question I have for you is, tell us about your Dymaxion car number 4.
Well, in many ways, you've covered that. I mean, I can perhaps expand a little on it. With Elena, who you showed earlier in the exhibition in her gallery here in Madrid, where we displayed the car, we saw the exhibition that you referred to in New York, and saw the only surviving automobile, which, as you say, had no interior. And that was the start of the idea of recreating the 4th version. And we negotiated with the museum that held that surviving Dymaxion, and agreed an arrangement whereby we would borrow that for 1 year, and in return we would recreate the original interior, and that we would introduce glazing into the surviving one, which didn't even have.
Yes, Shoji was, and I were just absolutely thrilled because we had never seen the interior until you had
Havlada, sad state. So,
yeah.
As you quite rightly pointed out, you should. Henry Ford was a good friend of Buckminster Fuller,
right?
And he said to Bucky that he could get for 1/3 the price, I think it was, any component. So the Dymaxion, which significantly outperformed the Ford sedan of that time, uses all the standard components of the Ford sedan. So it is the same engine, it's the same transmission. Obviously, it's a different chassis, it's tiller steering. So here you can see the evolution of that in the workshop. And finally, on an airfield where we tested it out. And I mean, just an extraordinary experience, as you pointed out in the film. It could turn in its own length. It literally could spin on.
When a regular car can only go 34 degrees, this one went 360.
Yes, and spinning it was really quite an experience. It was almost like aerobatic flying, which was another fascination of mine, because the horizon would spin around. No, it was quite dramatic, and it still turns heads, and is part of the foundation archive. So the homage to Bucky continues.
Yes, thank you very much. The next question I have for you, Norman, is that I understand you acquired one of the prototypes of Bucky's last domes that we worked on, and that's the Fly Eyes dome. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, the Fly Eyes was, I mean, his one of his last creations, and I spent time with the individual who made the molds and created the original prototype. So many years later, there was the opportunity to purchase for the archive that very first prototype, and that was the previous image that you saw. And and interestingly in the background. So moving on, that's Bucky with the original Dymaxion and the large fly's eye dome. And we lent to I think it was a Miami design week. We lent the version number 4 against the large Dymaxion fly's eye dome.
Yeah.
So, and I was asked to adopt a similar pose to the one of
yes,
Buck. It was very flattering.
I thought that was very appropriate, Norman. Next question I have
It was a
is
great celebration.
yes, it was. The next question I have, Norman, is do you have any Bucky Fuller related projects at your NF Foundation?
Well, we have the original documents that were sketched at the time, and so Bucky had this utopian vision of something that we called Climatrophis, and it was the idea of decks interconnected with greenery, which is not shown in this sketch section, but the idea of using trees and vegetation within a layered workplace with the artificial sky of a very lightweight membrane, and the next image shows a visualization of that. And it's quite interesting that in many ways this anticipated a movement since called biophilia, named after a book of that title by A.E.O. Wilson, a scientist who extolled in that book the virtues of the importance of the connection with nature. So this was a decade before that, and that was the inspiration for a kind of competition entry that Bucky and Thomas and our little team in London worked on together, which was the a pavilion, a reinterpretation of an energy event in Knoxville, which was going to be a series of separate pavilions. And I think it's the next image that gives a flavor of that. And you can see the link between that and the climate office project. And the next image is a diagrammatic cross section through that. And the idea, I suppose, is a reinvention of the 1851 Great Exhibition in London with the Crystal Palace, where instead of the individual pavilions, you would have one very large enclosure, and you would have, as it were, buildings within that building instead of individual pavilions. And of course, that was again rooted very much in later projects, the dome over Manhattan, the idea of conserving energy, creating a protective microclimate. So there is a connection between these different projects. The next image shows how that might appear. And then there was a model, which you can see here, covering the entire exposition grounds in Knoxville. And then we did a number of diagrams, which the next image shows how it might be reused as an exhibition hall, museum, or an indoor park, kind of botanical covered gardens, or maybe for conventions or trade fairs. So again, thinking beyond the life of the event itself.
It's interesting that you showed the model of the previous with the model of it, because Bucky, when we were talking about the Cleveland State Caterpillar Dome, he says that we should think about something more than just a sports arena, and so you captured that very well in that particular event. So this is, yeah, I find that very interesting that it came back again, so to speak.
Recurring themes.
Yes, it did indeed. The last question I think I want to ask you is that the Sainsbury, you have on the Sainsbury Art Center. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, this unbuilt project for a house is very much in the spirit of the Sainsbury Centre. You saw a glimpse of that with Bucky and I around that glass table. What you wouldn't see is that it's really a very large volume, and within the depth of the structure are the smaller spaces like bathrooms, kitchens, dark room for the photography studio, the smaller spaces that enable the larger volume to work. And in many ways, this unbuilt house project within the depth of that structure would have the smaller, the bathroom elements as pods. And the next image shows the very cavernous interior. And on the exterior, which if we look at the cross section, then you can see on the right, if you look closely, you can see that it's a section through a bathroom element, and then three-dimensionally shows a drawing. And if you look at the top left, you'll see that pod, and that has a remarkable resemblance to the patent drawing of Bucky's miniaturized, mechanized, industrialized bathroom. And the next image shows the patent for that. So whether the reference is the connection is a is a building like the Gherkin tall building, whether it's an unbuilt project like this, as I say, whether it's the Reichstag Dome, or whether it's in the foundation here in Madrid, which is about sustainable cities and which is very much the kind of heritage, the legacy of many things that Buckminster Fuller was preaching and endeavoring to communicate good messages to younger generations. So his spirit is very much alive and well.
Thank you very much. Norman, I know that Bucky is smiling right now. Indeed, I'm so bold to say that thank you very much on behalf of all of us, and especially, as I said, Bucky is smiling. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Lord Foster and Thomas, but more particular, Lord Thomas, thank you for that. I mean, that collaboration with Bucky must have been quite incredible. I mean, it's for most of us that are on this side of this call, we certainly were not part of that, and it must have been quite a journey for you and for your office to be part of his life through all of those years. And it was great for you to be able to share it with us and the audience. So thank you for that. I'm going to introduce our next speaker to continue this celebration. Shirley Sharkey, who is the executive assistant, was the executive assistant and director of Fuller's office. She was a graduate of Southern Illinois University, SIU, where Fuller was a university professor for 12 years. Shirley was voted outstanding SIU freshman and sophomore and served as student secretary. After Carbondale, she moved with him to Edwardsville, then to Philadelphia. 11 years as both his executive assistant and director of the office. And she stayed with Bucky in the office until 6 months after his death in 1983. Shirley, welcome to this NORR and the celebration of Bucky. I'm glad to have you with us. I want to start off with, I mean, you spent an incredible number of years and you were probably the closest to Bucky, certainly his working life and daily life. I wonder if you can share with us some of your stories of Bucky and what he was like.
I actually worked with Bucky for 15 years, starting as a student worker in Carbondale. And I don't know that people are going to be tremendously interested in the office works because it wasn't that important when somebody's studying his work. But I'd like to take the opportunity to dispel some errors that are out there. Many books have been written since Bucky died, and when it comes to the office, they have totally incorrect information. For example, a recent biography said something to the effect that when Bucky had to leave the office for a speaking engagement, he gave the staff a lot of busy work to do. Well, anybody that knew Bucky in our office knew that was totally ludicrous because Bucky was gone about 95% of the time off. He would be in the office for maybe 2 days and gone for 2 months, back in the office for a couple of days, gone for several months. So we all had constructive work to do that Bucky wanted done, but he didn't have to personally supervise it on a daily basis. Another example of in this recent biography that seemed very well researched, but there was something about when Bucky left town, he told the staff to make sure they kept the bathroom spotless. Well, we were always in a large office building and we had nothing to do with the bathrooms. The office, the building management took care of that. Anyway, so hopefully people will realize that they don't always, anything you read in print isn't necessarily true.
Right.
So I started in 1968 working for Bucky, and I was typist part-time in the afternoon. I was typist and receptionist. At that time, of course, there was no internet, no email, no faxes. Everything was hand typed on letterhead and mailed out. We had regular mail, and airmail was the biggie. So there was a tremendous amount of mail that came in the office, and much of the staff could handle it, but the mail that Bucky had to see personally was opened, date stamped, packaged up in a large envelope, and mailed to where he was going a few days hence. He would handwrite all the answers and mail it back to me, to the office. At that time, in Carbondale, it was a very large office. There was Dale Klaus and at least 2 assistants who took care of the archives, the manuscripts, the photographs. Thomas Turner was in charge of World Game, and he had probably 6 people on his staff. Naomi Wallace was Bucky's personal secretary. There was a bookkeeper. Anyway, by 1972, Bucky decided to leave Carbondale. We briefly went to Edwardsville, but Naomi didn't. The archive staff and the World Game staff was all let go. Naomi didn't want to move. And so Bucky asked me if I would move the office. We ended up getting an offer from Philadelphia to go. We were going to be housed at the University City Science Center, and Bucky received a small stipend. When I went to Philadelphia to make the arrangements, they showed me this lovely office for Bucky on the first floor with a lot of windows and my desk right outside. And I said, well, thank you very much, but that won't work. We need several thousand square feet. The archives themselves took a tremendous amount of space, plus I was going to be hiring more staff. We did eventually average about 8 people, so much more efficient than Carbondale. I'd like to mention a few of those outstanding staff. Medard Gable took care of World Game, Amy Edmondson did design, and Mintz took care of the archives. Kiyoshi Kuromia started as a simple typist, but he was so capable, he ended up really working with Bucky on his books near the end. Let's see. I took care of all the mail, took care of Bucky's incredible schedule, paid the bills. I don't think anyone would really understand Bucky's schedule. He worked constantly. He could be in Chicago one day, Atlanta the next day, giving a talk or an interview, California the next day. Later on, I will show you an example of his schedule. I want to give an aside about Bucky as just a human being. It was so wonderful to work with. I think a lot of people, when they hear or see a video of Bucky, think he's really pretty gruff. I think the 2 things that Tom presented, hearing Bucky, he really sounds pretty gruff. But he was the most thoughtful, considerate person you can imagine. And my example is, now you can show that first, a photo. When I became pregnant, Bucky immediately said, get Krim for the office. So that photo is Bucky with my daughter in the crib. There we go, Bucky with my daughter in the crib. And then the next image shows Bucky in his personal office with her. Just gives you an example what a thoughtful, loving man he was. People also don't realize how much fun Bucky was. We worked very hard, but when we had free time, we'd go out to lunch or dinner or something. Bucky always had a fun story. He'd sing his silly songs that he made up. Anyway, it was just a wonderful time of my life, and I will cherish it always. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Just one last question. I mean, we've all seen the number of videos. I mean, I've watched a number of them that are on YouTube. The content for those videos, did Bucky write all of the content for the lectures? Did you assist with those? How were those written? Because some of the lectures went on for hours. And
yes, Bucky never wrote he did not have prepared speech. He just started talking, and yes, it could go on for a long time. Oh, and I forgot. I wanted to show an example of his schedule. So the next picture, I think it was his itinerary starting June 14th. Gives you an idea of his schedule. Okay, June 14th, he's in California. He's got to stay one extra day, and was living in a house in Pacific Palisades. And Bucky, of course, did when he was occasionally there. Fly from Los Angeles to San Francisco the next day. Spend almost the whole day at opening. That night, take the red eye from San Francisco to arrive Philadelphia. Work in the Philadelphia office probably for 1 hour. Another night flight from Philadelphia, this time with me, to London. Several meetings that day. No jet lag time here. The next day, you see meetings, 9 o'clock. Then most of the day working with Norman. Tea, dinner, another day. Meeting, interview, meeting with Norman again. And this is that evening is when Norman Foster received the gold medal. The next day, you see 9 a.m. An interview. 10 to 4:30, meet with Norman. Later, another interview for a newspaper. Then, of course, he's driven to the BBC for an interview on television. Dinner that night. This had to be about the longest day of my life. We kept traveling west, so we kept changing time zones. So we ended up, it must have been a 35-hour day. And you can see he has a meeting at 9, another meeting at 10, another meeting at 11. By 1, we fly from London to Washington, D.C., take a helicopter to the White House. Bucky gives a talk at the White House, back to the airport, fly to Chicago, check into the hotel so that we can change clothes because it's a black tie dinner for people that had been on Time magazine cover. Remember, Bucky is 88 years old at this stage. Yeah. Next morning, meet with Tom Zung, then fly from Chicago to Los Angeles, and I, of course, flew back home. A week later, exactly, the Friday, Bucky went to Los Angeles because Anne was dying of cancer. Was in the hospital dying of cancer. And the next Friday, when Bucky's grandson Jamie phoned me, we totally assumed it was Anne, but no, Bucky had had a fatal heart attack. And that was it.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
And thank you for being part of this. I'm going to move on to our next guest, and if I can have the next guest slide, please. I'm going to bring on Alexandra May, is Fuller's only granddaughter. She was raised in California and spent her summers with her grandfather on the family's island in Maine. The island was central influence on Fuller's focus on nature's principles. Alexandra's mother, Allegra, was noted professor of dance and anthropology at UCLA. Her father, Robert, was a documentary film director. Alexandra worked in arts management. She was the associate director of Isma Nokoshi Museum in New York City, and in the early years, she was curatorial advisor to the exhibit of Nogoshi and one of his mentors, the ink brush master Kuibashi. Alexandra and her brother Jamie Snyder are the co-executors of the Buckminster Fuller estate. Welcome, Alexandra, to this session. So, Alexandra, if you can come on camera, please.
I'm
there.
on.
You are. Perfect. So, Alexandra, maybe you can. Obviously, you're the only granddaughter for Buckminster Fuller, and maybe you can talk to us about what it was like growing up as his granddaughter and your experiences through your career as well.
Yes. Well, thank you to the organizers for including me in today's event. I'm here with a personal perspective as Buckminster Fuller's granddaughter, I think we're very fortunate that all the speakers today had not only long professional relationships with my grandfather, but also close personal ones as well. So what I can bring to the table is the family part of his personal story. I was born in 1953, my brother Jamie in 1955. Our mother Allegra grew up as an only child. Her only sibling, Alexandra, my namesake, died at age 4, 5 years before Allegra was born. You can imagine that these two events, the death of one child and the subsequent birth of another, were very significant in my grandfather's evolution. Alexandra's death, due to illnesses related to the Spanish flu epidemic and environmental factors, left my grandfather feeling devastated and powerless. Then in 1927, the birth of a second healthy, happy, beautiful child became a powerful catalyst in Bucky's asking himself what he as an individual could do on behalf of all of humanity. By the time his grandchildren came along, Bucky's work was greatly accelerating, and so were his travels around the planet. My early memories were of my grandparents traveling together, arriving at our home in California from a trip abroad. My grandmother, Anne Hewlett Fuller, loved those experiences. I remember how she delighted in a trip to Japan where the gardens and cultural aesthetics captivated her. Until the end of my grandfather's life, his pace accelerated, and Spaceship Earth seemingly became smaller. I think these words that my grandfather offered my brother are apt. When Jamie was feeling quite homesick, his first year away from home at college, Bucky consoled him. He told Jamie that as he, Bucky, traveled the world, he felt that he was not leaving home, but that his own backyard just kept getting bigger. As Bucky's backyard grew ever larger, so much so that he circumnavigated the globe numerous times in years when air travel was relatively new, my grandmother's energy level declined and she progressively stayed home or in place. Those itineraries that Shirley showed us were important, as Shirley knows, very important to my grandmother. There were multiple times in a day when Anne would pull out the itinerary and note, where was Bucky that day? Who was he meeting with? Where was he lecturing? Where was he be staying that afternoon? And sometimes with concern, she wondered whether he would have gotten any sleep the night before. My grandfather's attention was outward, starting with universe, but he was always attuned to his wife, Anne. Bucky took to wearing 3 wristwatches, which he would proudly display. One would be set for his current location, another set for the place he would be traveling to, and a third always set for my grandmother's location. I believe he called her frequently, given a time when overseas phone conversations were difficult. Though he was a citizen of Spaceship Earth, he never missed holidays with us in California, and he made sure he was able to get to Bear Island every summer. The island off the coast of Maine was purchased by Bucky's grandmother in 1904 when my grandfather was 9 years old. The 40-acre island, 10 miles from the mainland, had no electricity nor running water and provided an intimate relationship with the natural world. I know my grandfather credited observations of nature's principles, which he employed in his artifacts and in his synergetic geometry, with the time spent on the island. It was also the place where he began his relationship to boats and navigating the seas, which continued in the Navy. In the many summers spent together on the island, my grandfather introduced my brother and I to sailing and to being comprehensive in our awareness of our island environment. My grandfather was very playful. The lyrics that he wrote, which Thomas shared with us, Roam Home to a Dome, are one example of numerous songs, ditties, and poems that my grandfather continually created. He was ever excited and delighted by the world around him, and at the same time, he saw an enormous task of learning how to live sustainably with our resources. He could be playful, break into a jitterbug dance or a tune, but he was always, always working on solving humanity's challenges. On the island, my grandfather was regularly found late into the night, sitting at the dining table, writing under the meager light of a kerosene lamp. Often the following evening at dinner, with family and friends, he would ask one of us to read out loud his writing of the previous night. Then that night, he would continue on in the editing process, writing and rewriting. Again, Shirley had to retype all those things that he would send to her, but writing and rewriting, always honing the best way to communicate to others what he felt sure we would all want to know in order to make a utopian rather than an oblivion of our futures. He took this responsibility very seriously. He would endeavor to fully address questions posed by young and old, but particularly by the young. He felt that their understanding of universe was the hope for the future, and that he ultimately had great faith in them. Thomas Zung asked me to reflect today on my years working with one of Bucky's close friends, the Japanese-American sculptor Isamu Noguchi, at Noguchi's Museum in New York City. Luckily, there are books written about this friendship because it is a very big subject, and I have run out of time. What I want to say is that Isamu was one of many close friends of my grandfather's who were artists, writers, musicians, designers, and dancers. My mother, who was a dance anthropologist, a very creative person herself, put together an exhibit years ago about her father's cross-fertilization with so many creative people and what that tells us about Bucky's own process and perspective. Some who were included in that exhibit were Christopher Morley, Isamu Noguchi, Charles and Ray Eames, Merce Cunningham and John Cage, Joseph and Ani Albers, Ruth Asawa, Starling Burgess, John Houston, and of course those on the panel today. The intellectual and creative diversity of those my grandfather comported with was certainly a vast and rich constellation. And I apologize, Thomas, that I won't venture to start with that universe today. I do have a few personal pictures to share just for the fun of it. This is a picture of Jamie, my brother Jamie, and I in rapt attention as our grandfather shows us an astronomical globe and describes the big picture. The photo is a bit staged, but certainly was not an uncommon scene. It is a still from a film our father, Robert Snyder, a documentary film director and producer, made that included Bucky, titled Sketchbook 3 Americans. Next picture. This is a photo in our backyard in Los Angeles, and it shows me playing on a play dome. Like many children then and now, play domes were an introduction to geodesic structures. And next picture. This is a tender moment with my grandfather, my mother at our side on a boat in Maine, going to hear him lecture at the small church in Deer Isle that he did regularly. The next picture is one showing my grandfather at work, always at work. My brother Jamie took this picture one night on the island without my grandfather's knowledge, and he captured our grandfather writing late at night at the dining table with a kerosene lamp as his source of light, and it was a very familiar scene. Next picture is my grandfather and I visiting a dome constructed by a friend in that friend's backyard. There were many such domes erected in the 60s and 70s that my grandfather, his friends and family, we would visit. And the last picture I have is of a tensegrity dome, the tensegrity dome on Bear Island. The dome had been resurrected over many years. As wooden structural pieces rotted and broke down, they were replaced, and the structural integrity always held. So thank you.
Alexandra, thank you for that family history. It really adds to this session. And thank you for sharing that with us.
Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring on the final speaker. Tommy Zung is an architectural designer and curator with over 30 years of experience spanning architecture, fashion, and his own design studio Zung. His work is informed by a holistic, mindful approach and a unique perspective shaped by his upbringing among architectural greats like his father, Thomas T.K. Zung, a partner of visionary Buckminster Fuller. Zung has continued the tradition of environmental integrity championed by Buck B. Fuller. His work has earned recognition from various corners, with Architectural Digest naming him one of the top 10 firms to watch in 2015. Welcome, Tommy, to this session. If you can come on camera, please.
Thank you, Silvio. Can you, am I with you?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you again for...
Maybe you can share with us. I think Thomas has shown some images of you on one of the geodesic domes already, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it was like for you growing up. You're quite small in that image, but maybe you can share with us your memories of Bucky and growing up, not only with Bucky, but obviously your father.
Yes, thanks, Silvio. I love this picture for context because it shows that at the beginning, meeting Bucky was during my formative years. This is my father's elongated dome in Cleveland, Ohio. I believe just after he had completed it. And then I was in a bit of a preteens when Bucky passed away in '86. Spent a lot of time with him, as Shirley has mentioned, because he was always on the move. So we would see him in different areas. But my perspective is different, unique in a way, because what I love about this photo is it gives context to the formative years of myself as a child and growing up with Bucky in these environments. And my relationship with Bucky was incredibly special because, as you see, as a young person, I mean, he was my hero for so many reasons. And the one that sits deepest in my heart is how he always spoke to me as someone worthy of his understanding or attention. He treated everyone with that same level of respect and presence, even though I was young. You could feel that. It was very, very honest. Bucky's impact on my life was immense, especially during my formative years like this. I experienced it as osmosis, and through osmosis, I learned so much by simply listening to him converse with luminaries like Osamu Noguchi and the other artists of Black Mountain College. Their discussions were about dance and theory, poetry, very fabric of life that opened my eyes to alternative modes of learning and anti-establishment approaches to education, if you will. But Bucky was not overtly an anti-institution. He believed passionately in power of some spontaneous connective learning. And I always experienced him with honesty, directness, whether engaging with younger students or his peers. I could feel that. Bucky wanted me and my schoolmates to maintain our imaginative faculties, if you will. He spoke a lot about faculties. Something he felt traditional schooling often tried to teach away. I think that's how I may have remembered that. And one instance, the one that was amazing, was he lectured at my school. He taught us geometry and structure, like true intuitive geometry and physics. It was really triangle versus square as a structure, e.g. structural integrity. Mind you, this is an entire school in the morning, and he's up on stage. And Bucky's nature was playful, like Alexander and Shirley said. He was animated, and he constructed this square out of, you would use wood and rubber. He first made a one-dimensional square, and then he formed it into a four-dimensional square. And of course, it wouldn't hold its shape and or its structure on its own because, you know, as architects, we know it needs cross bracing once you make it a four-dimensional structure. And he animatedly flopped it, squished it, smashed it down, and kind of threw it down onto his lap. Then he deconstructed it. He made it into a one-dimensional triangle. Then he made it into a three-dimensional triangle. And he showed how that had all of its structural integrity. And he was completely, the happiness just filled him. It filled the auditorium, the excitement and happiness. The entire school laughed with him. It was just incredible feeling. Like everybody was elated and just completely captivated. And as Shirley well knows, Bucky had a habit of going well over his scheduled lecturing time. And that headmaster, interrupted Bucky mid-lecture. He walks onto stage and politely thanks him and notified the students that school was starting. And then if you knew Bucky, you could imagine that didn't sit very well with him. But true to his gracious and compassionate nature, Bucky definitely did not react with anger. Instead, he drew on his cheeky intelligence and he turned to democracy as a solution. So Bucky said to the headmaster, "I'm teaching something fundamentally important which is not taught here. So let's ask all the kids to vote if they'd like to hear more from me or if they'd like to go back to their scheduled classes." Entire audience and everybody just erupted in approval and clapping and just, everybody was elated. And Bucky said, "Thank you. So let's continue." That's the influence that profoundly shaped my perspective of knowledge, creativity, sustainability, and authentic human dialogue. Even now, his lasting impact, it manifests in how I approach life and learning, and the respect and admiration that I still hold for him is a testament to his enduring legacy as a mentor and model. Bucky taught me through osmosis. Another kind of fun one was his playful nature and his sense of humor. So I love baseball, and I think I was much older than this, and still in Little League. Maybe I was older than this, but I'm in Little League at this time. And I can remember he signed a copy of The Maximum World by Buckminster Fuller. That book had come out, really great one. If you do not have it, please get it because it's a great read, easy, has everything in it. And he sketched out a baseball field that he put me in it. And I'm pretty sure he had colors in it. Right, Shirley, Dad, I definitely had some colors, and he wrote, keep throwing the ball at 299 miles, 792,458 meters per second. And I loved how he matched how I love to play baseball, and he encouraged me to throw baseball at the speed of light. Of course, I'm young. I have no idea what that was. And I have to ask him what that meant. He said to me something like, "That's the speed of light, dear boy." And that simple statement in his drawing, his simple answer was yet another seed that made me wonder. It made me want to understand the deeper meaning of both the universe and myself, and much more than that, what I was being taught traditionally. And it brings to mind what was spoken earlier when Norman showed Bucky a building of, when Norman showed Bucky a new building of his, and Bucky asked Norman, how much does this building weigh? This one question, I believe, was a sea change to Norman's thinking and approach. This was the power of Bucky's seeds. Bucky planted many seeds in me, and he instilled me to think differently about everyday actions that we do. But there's a much deeper intention in our actions if we're aware of them. And he was also saying that he believed in me, that I could achieve the extraordinary if I envisioned that I threw that ball at the speed of light, or in the bigger picture of things, that one could think differently and achieve the extraordinary, any one of us. Bucky taught me to think differently and achieve the extraordinary for the benefit of all beings, or for all humankind, again, through osmosis. And then there's another funny one. My dad loves this one. As Alexander said, he absolutely loved Bear Mountain. It was a very special place. Energetically amazing, very organic, because again, there's much there. You know, he had domes that you could play on and riding skips and etc. Anyway, Bucky compensated for his poor eyesight by refining all of his other senses. And if you've ever seen something, he's spoken about this. Obviously, he was cross-eyed when he was young. He has the same vision at 4 years old as he did when he was 70, 80, etc. So he spoke of feeling through acuteness of hearing, smelling, and tactile touch was what he would say. So these are his other senses. And we all know he's thought four-dimensionally, right? He would draw that quite often. I didn't fully understand what he meant by this until one summer we were on Bear Island, and Bucky wanted to go for ice cream. So he's like, okay, let's go, Tommy, we're going to go get ice cream. So we took the boat off Bear Island, and he gets in a Honda, I believe it was, and we start to drive off, and we go get ice cream. And we come back to Bear Island, and then everybody's upset at Bucky. He got in trouble with the family because he didn't even have a driver's license. And like, the funny thing was he used all of his, I mean, funny and then unfunny, like I felt completely safe, but he used all of his senses, even though he couldn't see. And I never, ever felt anything. The other occasion was when we went to see John Denver. Maybe you can show this next slide, please. This one's funny. So we go to see, so I'm getting a little bit older. So we go to see John Denver perform, and Bucky's hearing aids, and his office. Shirley could speak more to exactly how it all came about. But Bucky's office invented these headphones that would help him hear John's concert. And Bucky was ecstatic of the crazy-looking headphone contraption with the antennas, because he was really happy because of the technology. But not only the technology, more importantly, it was a thoughtful innovation that would assist him in activating all of his senses. That's what I get out of it. His office used technology to think mindfully, to put together something so he could have another sense to experience John Denver's music when he was hard of hearing and could barely see. So, of course, the experience was extremely fun. Bucky was full of love, full of life, although what I was left with, Bucky was in full connection with all of his senses. Most importantly, his sixth sense that he used for all of humanity. And it's in this ethos and other teachings of Bucky that Shoji, my father, committed to championing and to realizing, which we're trying to, which we are doing with the Buckminster Fuller Partners Foundation, stewarding this type of thinking for humanity. Norman is a incredible testament to that. And so, you know, in '86, I'm older than this, but I'm still young. And I remember Bucky is extremely gentle and loving. Metaphysical embracement. I come to understand what he said. Metaphysical embracement, the tolerance of all, as he said. Bucky said, love is metaphysical gravity. And Bucky's taught me how to work to make the world a better place, to think of things sustainable, to look at Spaceship Earth and all humanity with love. He would say omni-embracing, without expectations, to create unity. Bucky introduced me to metaphysical ideas that was incredibly important, and they've been a guide for my entire life, my architectural work, and I am just immensely grateful to Bucky and my father for that lineage. I think the last thing that, again, because through osmosis and through being young, you realize these things later in life. I can't speak to the other aspects. You know, my father, Norm, and Shirley, or as a granddaughter in the house all the time. But one quote that I have to read, that Bucky said quite clearly, "Our task is predominantly metaphysical, for it is how to get all of humanity to educate itself swiftly enough to generate spontaneous social behaviors that will avoid extinction." And he lived every bit of his life, and I'm incredibly grateful to him for instilling the metaphysical, but also the realization of sustainable work. So thank you for inviting. I hope that offers something as a formative young boy.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Tommy. And I wonder if I could have Lord Foster come back on screen, and Alexandra, if you could both come back on screen so we can have a final discussion. This has been an incredible celebration, a treat for everyone that's been on. And the NORAD Master Series, Thomas and I talked over a year ago, and I'm glad to have Thomas on and for him to have accepted it. I'm equally happy that we have the panel that we have, because this has brought a very rich background to Bucky Fuller, and there are thousands of videos out there that people can see, and there are thousands of books, but this is very special because it's really a group of people that knew him, and you can't capture this in books and videos. So I really appreciate what's happened here. This year, our NORAD was about five things that we wanted to accomplish in NORAD, and the speakers that we brought on. It was about sustainability. It was about net zero. It was about livability and human-centric design. It was about buildings as part of our environment, resilience against extreme weather conditions. Those 5 things, when I sat down over a year and a half ago to look at speakers, Bucky was the first thing that came to mind, because Bucky did that, and he did that in the 20s and the 30s, and he didn't do it last week. And to me, where we stand today, I'm not sure that the world is that much further ahead. And I think that, you know, we're moving, but, you know, we need to somehow look back at what Bucky did, and I think Lord Foster, I mean, it is quite incredible that you've actually been able to work with him, and you're certainly doing it, but the rest of the world somehow needs to catch up. So I want to open this up to all of you, Thomas, Lord Foster, and others, to try to, you know, come to a basic wrap up, a conclusion on this session of, you know, talking about Buckminster Fuller. And I will open it up. Thomas, maybe you or Lord Foster would like to lead us in trying to find a conclusion to the discussion today.
I don't know if this is more of a conclusion than it is a question, and that is, for people that have learned about Bucky, I think their question might be, what's next? And I think what's next is one of the things that Norman Foster's done, which I had the fun to go visit, and that's in his Norman Foster Foundation. I thought maybe, Norman, you might talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Perhaps to set the scene for that, it's more than 40 years ago that Bucky gave the Royal Gold Medal address in my honor, and that was 10 days before he passed away. And he was with Shirley. I remember clearly the time, and his address is as fresh, radical, to the point, environmentally, in terms of energy. He talked in that address about fossil fuels, about the resources for Killingry, the way in which if they were harnessed, it would change the standard of living. I mean, it was quite amazing. He compared the weight of the geodesic dome and its reliance on tension rather than compression of St. Peter's. He compared the weights. One was 30 tons, the other was 30,000 tons, 1,000th of the weight. So I think that those messages are absolutely timeless in terms of their relevance. And if I was fortunate to be able to learn so much from an individual of such extraordinary wisdom, and I'll come back to Bucky as a person in a moment. But so Thomas's point about the foundation, its workshops, preparing younger generations to anticipate the future, and the more recent institute. This last weekend we had the first graduation of a master's course on sustainable cities, and I never realized until perhaps this evening that that course and its whole emphasis, which combines real life experience with a city, working with city administrations, but rooted in an academic background of knowledge and information in terms of what really a sustainable city is, where it's not consuming vast amounts of energy by sprawling, but extolling the virtues of the traditional compact city, comparing the carbon footprints. All of this is pure Buckminster Fuller, and to see the graduates who joined that course, many from schools of architecture, others from schools of engineering, others not coming out of a design background, but coming out of city administrations, and just individuals who are passionate about the future of society, which is totally embodied in the future of cities. So we're all, I think, those of us very grateful recipients of Bucky's wisdom. I'd say one last thing, and that was touched on earlier, and that is Bucky as a person. He had an extraordinary sense of humor and was probably the ultimate model of a gentleman. He was always impeccably dressed, no matter where he'd been, the time change, he was absolutely immaculate. And the way he would stay at the Stafford Hotel and the manner in which he would discreetly reward everybody there, who, from the doorman to the waiters, he would hand discreetly a little envelope with a, so this is a person who was about humanity, but was the very essence of the gentleman, of the ultimately civilized individual.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
That's very well said. Very well said. Thomas,
you might also mention that we had talked about with at Apple, not what but with Shoji, yourself, Maya, and Tommy, about also doing some kind of a legacy for Bucky with the Buckminster Fuller Partners Foundation. You want to talk a little bit about that? And Tommy, you want to talk about that?
Well, I believe that what's incredibly important is what we're all talking about, which are the ethos, the sustainability, the math, the science of Bucky. He touched everything, but most importantly, his main objective was sustainability, humanity, living together peacefully, not weaponry. Like Norman was saying, it's incredibly important. You and Shoji were like samurai stewards for Bucky. Same with Shirley. What I saw was the facilitation of a great man always needs other greatness around, man, woman, otherwise, in order to steward in meaningful changes. Norman Foster is clearly doing that through his foundation, education of the cities, his master series. I encourage everybody to go there because it's a very dynamic website. It's very clear and accessible, digestible. Bucky wasn't about one. Oh, you have to be an architect, you have to be a poet, you have to be a writer, you have to be a scientist, etc. Not that I had seen. He was about how do we forward humanity through civilization and keep spaceship Earth alive and otherwise. And that comes through technology, it comes through so many areas. I don't want to get deep into it, but what you are doing, and unfortunately Shoji has passed, is making sure that the ideas of Bucky's are supported and they have educational currency to them, and it's those ethos are kept alive and are stewarded. So overreaching, that's what has to happen, which is the foundation has to encourage the education and the ethos that you and Shoji were doing, supporting great ideas.
Norman, we have a little different perspective in that I'm invited to schools to talk about Bucky, mostly architectural schools. I'm always amazed, Norman, that how few of the architectural students know anything about Fuller. And that I find that astonishing. And so this is one of the things, Alexandra, you and I have talked about that too. Is that, boy, this is architects engineering, and this is only 50 years ago. And they've almost a forgotten man. And this is, I find that very disturbing, and I think this is one of the reasons we're hoping very much for Norman's foundation and for what we're going to try to do to bring him back up, and not only his books but really his ideas, because the fragility, as Norman said, of Earth. I mean, ask the polar bear if there isn't a climate problem. Ask some of these people that are getting forest fires, and they just don't get it. And this whole recent political astonishing is going to make it even more difficult, because there is a climate change and people just are either, as Bucky would say, either ignorant or they're selfish, one or the other. And somehow that needs to be turned around.
Thomas, it's fascinating that that as I listen and think back, that Bucky was very much about the data. He was always separating out the reality, the truth, what the evidence was telling you through his research into pollution, chemicals, recycling, all the words that are common parlance today, but at that time was very much an outlier. And I realized that that as I talk about the course on sustainable cities with graduates, with scholars, I'm emphasizing the importance of separating out fact from fashion, from prejudice, coming back to the evidence-based policies that should be followed for a sustainable city, improving the quality of life for everybody. And of course, I say this, and perhaps it needs the event of this evening to remind oneself of where so much of this comes from.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. You know, he described how much a gallon of gas really cost. It isn't $1.34 or $3.34. He'd add in all the pollution and all the subsidies and all the things, and he'd end up with that 1 gallon of gas costs about $63 a gallon. And he did this by data. So this was incredible that he did this with a lot of things. The other thing I found it interesting is that when Bucky was born, it was like 1.6 or 1.5 billion people in the world. When he died, Alexandra, it was about 4.4. Right now, today, it's about 8 billion people. In 2050, there's going to be 10 billion people. And Norman, you had mentioned about AO's from Harvard University, and he said that 10 billion people is about what's sustainable. What's the population going to be at the year 3000? We have the same amount of land, the same amount of ocean that we keep polluting. So what's going to happen? And the only way to sustainable is to go back on some of the things that Bucky's talking about, sustainable universe. And this is something that's really going to be, in fact, I think the next war that it's going to be, it's not going to be about people, it's going to be about food. Simply, it's going to be about food because there's not enough food to sustain, say, the year 2000, the year 3000, I'm sorry, whatever number the population is going to be, or the year 4000. Good grief, you know, what's going to happen? You know, so we're going to have to go back and some of the principles and ideas that Fuller said for a sustainable Earth, you know, planet Earth.
I think that you're both right. I think the only thing that I want to add to it is that the schools of architecture are important. The schools of engineering are equally important because I always have we're an A&E firm, and I always have difficulty finding that fine line between architecture and engineering. To me, they're one and the same, and we need both of them, and both are equally important. But I agree with you, Thomas. When you take a look at the schools of architecture or engineering, the name Buckminster Fuller doesn't come up anymore, which is one of the reasons a year and a half ago when you and I talked, I said we have to do this and we have to put it out. And obviously compliments to you, Lord Foster, for what you're doing, and Thomas for what you're doing, and Tommy for what you're doing. And I just wish that all of the architectural magazines would actually publish this a lot more than they do today. They don't, because they go after a completely different crowd that they're interested in, which is very unfortunate. But I think we need to keep doing this and trying to get the word out, because there is a lot of value and there's a lot of credit that really goes to Bucky. And as long as I'm around, I'm not going to stop doing this. And I know that Lord Foster isn't, and Thomas, neither are you, or Alexander, or Shirley, or Tommy that are on this line. So with that,
thank you for inviting us to have this NORRED educational series. I hope that the YouTube will open up the minds to architects and engineers that have kind of forgotten about Bucky.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to remind him with this. And Thomas, I want to thank you for doing this and being on this session. Lord Foster, many thanks for you joining us to be part of this. Shirley, Alexandra, and Tommy, once again, thank you. And Lord Foster, good evening, and have a good evening. And for the rest of you, have a great afternoon. Yeah. And for those of you that are on the line, the students and all of the rest of the audience, many thanks for joining us for this celebration of Buckminster Fuller, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye to everyone.